Let's go straight right now to my next guest, Colonel Richard Kemp. He's the former commander of British forces in Afghanistan and joins us now to talk about what's going on in Ukraine. Good morning to you, Richard.
Good morning.
Thank you so much for joining us. It's absolutely fascinating, the boast from a Ukraine chief that Putin's military is only the second best military, even in Russia, because of that incursion more than a week long now by Ukrainian forces. And we've now learned that British tanks have been involved in those incursions in Ukraine. What do you make of this, and how significant is this?
I think it's an extraordinary move by Ukraine, smashing into Russian sovereign territory in Kursk. Against a very badly defended area. So it's hardly surprising that Ukrainians were able to make such ground, but of course they shouldn't have. They've had to build up significant forces far in advance of this operation, and that should have been detected and reacted to by the Russians, but clearly they failed. But nevertheless, it's a very significant move. And I think, we don't know yet what the Ukrainians' strategic objective is here. They haven't said so quite rightly.
Yes. And they didn't share this information. They didn't share the information with the allies, including US, who were providing a lot of the weaponry, about why they were doing this. And let's talk about it, basically diverting Russian forces so they can make more inroads, seizing back their own territory, but also as part of the negotiations where they announced yesterday more than 1,000 Russian troops has been taken as prisoners of war during that incursion. And that will help negotiations to get their own people back.
I don't really buy the idea that the Americans didn't know about this in advance. I think that's highly unlikely. I think it's another symptom for the Americans to deny. It's another symptom that the Americans are afraid of provoking the Russians.
Yeah.
But I think you're right, that the seizure of this ground, if they're able to hold on to it for a length of time, which is very questionable, that might be a useful bargaining chip in peace negotiations, as you mentioned, maybe in prisoner of war exchange as well. But I think most critically in terms of when it comes to decide what the final laydown on the ground is, in the event of a peace negotiation, they will have a hard bargaining chip if they can hold on to it.
I mean, the use of these Challenger 2 tanks on Russian soil, that's going to be a concern for a lot of people in terms of the escalation of this war, isn't it? Because so long, the US and the EU and Britain kind of dragged their feet quite a lot in terms of the amount of and the kinds of military aid and hardware we were giving Ukraine as they were crying out for the fighter jets and goodness and the long-range missiles. And gradually they're getting the weaponry what they need, and now for the first time using them on Russian soil. Russia, Putin has always said, this is, this is an invasion by NATO. Can he not use this as grounds to justify, worse actions? Are there any concerns for you that this is going to involve an escalation of this conflict further?
I think it could do, and I think that's been, the fear of escalation, as in the Middle East war as well. Western policies driven by fear of escalation, and they shouldn't be fearful of escalation because, of course, the last thing Putin wants is to escalate this into an all-out war with NATO. But one point I would make is that we've seen, as you say, British tanks, we've seen German and American armoured vehicles in use in Kursk as well. What Britain and America have failed to do is to agree to allowing Zelensky to use long-range missiles to help protect the forces that have pushed into Russian territory, and that could make a very decisive difference. And again, that refusal to use, for example, British Storm Shadow missiles is a symptom of fear of Russian escalation, which I think is unfounded. I think we're going to end up allowing them to do it, and that's what's so frustrating. We keep dragging our heels on this. You mentioned the Middle East. Can I just very briefly ask you about this? Hamas, who run the health ministry in Gaza, they run everything in Gaza as a terrorist organisation. They've announced today the latest death figures in total from the war in Gaza as 40,005 Palestinians killed by Israeli weaponry, Israeli bombing. What do you make of that announcement? Well, of course, we can't go along with anything that Hamas says. It could well be an exaggeration. I think most critically, if we do take those figures as somewhere near the truth, I don't know, then what they don't do is differentiate between the fighters they've killed, that the Israelis have killed, and the civilians. And the Israelis estimate somewhere around 18,000, 19,000 terrorists that have been killed during the war. Now, that would equate, roughly speaking, to about 1-to-1, one terrorist to one civilian. It sounds very bad, but if you compare it to Afghanistan and Iraq, where respectively 5 civilians
were killed for every terrorist, and 3 civilians were killed for every terrorist. I think the Israelis, if these figures are correct, have achieved quite a phenomenal success in minimising harm.
And yet condemned around the world by many who clearly don't know as much about war as you do over civilian deaths, which again wouldn't happen if Hamas didn't hide among civilians and hadn't invaded Israel on October the 7th as well. I know you have to go. We have to go to the news. Richard Kemp, Colonel Richard Kemp, former commander of British forces in Afghanistan. Thank you very much indeed.